I was asked to talk about Moses, who's, I mean, if it's, in some ways, it's a very interesting idea to talk about Moses as leader, as military leader, because you think of, the Rabbi certainly talked about him as Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher. And you usually think of Moses as giving the Ten Commandments, and then later in Deuteronomy, he repeats all of the laws as well as the Ten Commandments. So you think of him, I mean, so when the rabbis talk about him as Moses our teacher, that's not just something, where they are sort of importing their own identity back to Moses, as if to say, we are sort of the Moses of our generation. They are doing that, but they are also talking about a very important part of the story of Moses in the Bible, where he really is our teacher. But in addition to that, he is the one, after all, who leads the people of Israel out of Egypt. He is the one who argues for them after the golden calf incident. You remember that just 40 days after they get the Ten Commandments, Moses is still up on the mountain, and they don't know whatever happened to him, and they convince Aaron to make this golden calf, right? And Moses comes down the mountain and sees this as a rebellion, and smashes the Ten Commandments, and so he has to go back up and get another copy of them. This is before the Xerox machine, but anyway, but it's certainly before email. But the point is that it was a crisis of leadership of a certain sort. But even more interestingly is that when he gets angry and smashes the Ten Commandments, God also is angry, and God wants to destroy the people and start all over again. And then Moses plays the defense attorney. We're not going to look at that passage tonight, but you may want to look at Exodus 32, 33, 34, and you'll see him. Just think of him as defense attorney, and you'll see the kinds of arguments he presents. Things like, what will the non-Jews say if you took us out of Egypt and look what happened, right? I mean, so this will be a blot on your reputation. Or, you promised that you would take this people out of Egypt. So I mean, he plays the defense attorney, even though he's angry at that same people. The same thing happens in Numbers 14, which is a story that you may not be as familiar with. My mother was an English teacher. Maybe a story with which you are not as familiar. Thank you, Mom. Anyway, but the point is that in that story, Moses sends 12 spies out to look at the land and tell them what it was like, and only 2 of the spies say that it's a good land and we should be able to take it over. 10 of the spies say it's filled with giants and we're going to be like grasshoppers in their eyes, and we're never going to be able to take over the land. And then God gets angry again, and then Moses has to play defense attorney again. But then God is willing to go ahead with this people, but there later are some punishments along the way. Now we're going to look at 2 stories, both in the book of Numbers. So this is, if you're a synagogue goer, these are the passages we read in May, June, July, depending upon the year. This coming year, by the way, Rosh Hashanah is in October, right? Yes. Yeah. So I'm sure it'll be July by the time we read these next year. But the point is that it's what you're going to see here is, again, a crisis of leadership. And what I'd like you to sort of have in the back of your mind is, again, on this Game of Thrones theme, in what sense is Moses playing a leader, and in what sense is he really not such a great leader, right? In other words, to what extent is he somebody exemplary as a leader, and to what extent is he giving in to his own personal, his own personal self-image, his own ego, I mean, all of those kinds of things, which of course human beings, Moses, even Moses, are not exempt from. I'm not going to change that sentence again. Okay, not supposed to end a sentence with a preposition. All right, anyway, so the first story we're going to look at is Korach. What I'd like you to do first is just read the story, just to remind yourself of it. It's on the first page. The reason why this is coming from this book that I co-authored with Arthur Rosette. This is a book that we wrote together for a course that we taught from 1974 until he retired and then later died at UCLA School of Law. We team taught a course on Jewish law there, and I still teach that course. This is the book that is about 2/3 of the materials for the course, and then every year we have for a third of the course. So the next page, the very next page, right? Page 230, right, in your packet, page 230. At the bottom of the page, it's not, it's upside, oh dear, all right. Upside down and backwards, oh well, Okay, so it's on page 230 at the bottom of the page, where it says Numbers chapter 16, verses 1 to 35. Okay, so if you will, read that and the top of the next page on 231 down to the bottom, and then it ends on 232 in the middle. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that, okay? How many of you have ever read this story before? Oh, good. Okay, good. What is now this is a story that, raises a lot of questions. This is not the kind of story, the story of Korach in Numbers chapter 16, is not the kind of story where you sort of read the story and you get warm fuzzies, right? And this is not the story that you want to tell to your kids when they're growing up and saying, be like Korach or something like that, right? Or even be like Moses in this, right? One of the things I want you to sort of have in the back of your mind is, to what extent do you think Moses is an estimable character in this story, right? Korach clearly is not, at least as the Bible presents it. But to what extent, is Moses somebody to aspire to be like? Korach takes a group of people, ultimately 250 of them, to rise up against Moses. Together, I'm just going back at the beginning of the story, together with 250 Israelites, chieftains of the community. So we're not talking about, people who happen to be members of the community and just come along. These are the chieftains. These are the leaders of the community, elected in the assembly, men of repute. Right? So we're talking about people who are esteemed in the community, 250 of them, and they say to Moses, "You have gone too far, for all the community are holy, all of them, and the Lord is in their midst. Why then do you raise yourselves above the Lord's congregation?" What's the argument here? What are they saying to Moses?
They're jealous.
Pardon me?
They're jealous.
They're jealous, yeah. They probably are jealous, but what they're not saying to them, "We're jealous of you, therefore give us some power." That's not what they're saying. What are they saying?
Oh, saying, wait a minute, why are you the one that's calling all the shots?
Right. Why are you the one that's calling all those shots? Given that we are, yeah?
That we all were at the foot of Mount Sinai and said, yes, we hear and we will do.
Yes, we were all at the foot of Mount Sinai. We were all told there. This is Exodus chapter 19, right, where God says to the people of Israel, you will be a holy people to me, a kingdom of priests and a holy people. Mamlechet Kohanim v'goy kadosh. Right? So all the people at the foot of Mount Sinai, this is just the chapter before the Ten Commandments in the book of Exodus. It's Exodus chapter 19, verse 6. You will be to me, atem to you li, mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. So if we are all, according to God, if we are all God's people and we are all a holy nation, then why are you, Moses and Aaron, the big shots, as it were? Shouldn't we all be this way? Yes. Please tell me your names as we go. Susan, go ahead.
Is it because they're Levites, or is it just...
Right. Well, there are those that are descendants of Reuven, right? So those would not be Levites, right? Because Reuven and Levi were two separate tribes.
If you say so.
Right. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, there were two separate. And the other thing is, these are chieftains of the community elected in the assembly.
So they also thought
They also thought. That's right. So these were not all.
What?
They also thought that they were, that they should have been leaders, that they should have been part of the leadership group.
Maybe they wanted to ask him who chose you to be
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what they're saying. Who chose you?
to be
to be the ultimate leaders. Yes.
Well,
Your name is?
didn't God tell them they would be a nation of priests before the golden calf? After the golden calf?
Yes.
That promise was taken back, and the Levites destroyed and killed about 2,500 Israel.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes.
Under Aaron and Moses.
Yeah. God tells them that they will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation in Exodus chapter 19. The 10 Commandments is Exodus chapter 20, and then you have 21 to 24 that are a series of laws, Elah HaMishpatim. These are the judgments you should put before me. And it's not until Exodus 32 to 34 that you get the golden calf incident. And then after the golden calf incident, you're right, there are punishments to be had, right? Now, the real question, though, is, does that mean that they are no longer holy? Because before, it depends on whether you accept the order of the Torah as it is, right? But in Leviticus 19, God said, which is before this chapter, right? Leviticus is the third book of the Bible, and Numbers is the fourth. So in Leviticus 19, God says to the people, right, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Right? So if the Torah is in the order in which it actually happened, right? And maybe not, okay? I mean, scholars are all over the map about Leviticus and Numbers as to when they were put together, right? But if that chapter came before this incident, then they would have regained their holiness by this time, right? I mean, even if they lost it after the golden calf incident, they would have regained it. In any case, they think for all the community are holy, all of them. So whatever their understanding of their status is that they're all holy, along the lines of what God promised before the golden calf incident and along the lines of Leviticus 19. So since we are all holy, why are you the big shots? That's the claim. And Moses heard this, he fell on his face. We'll just continue on. Then he spoke to Korach and all his company, saying, come in the morning, and the Lord will make known who is his and who is holy, and will grant him access to himself. He will grant access to the one he has chosen. Okay, so I'm not going to make this decision, and I'm not going to fight with you about this, right? I don't have it in my contract, so I can't get a lawyer to, defend my position here. So we're going to let God decide who is in fact the leader. And then the rest of the story unfolds, and what ultimately happens? God clearly chose Moses and Aaron, and he made that very clear by having the earth swallow up all of the 250 people that challenged his rule. So the question is, what was so bad about this, right? I mean, clearly the way that the Torah presents it was that it was a rebellion against Moses' leadership, and it was a terrible thing. Even God says so, because God opens the earth and has the earth swallow them up. But I want you to play defense attorney for a moment. A defense attorney for Korach, not for Moses. What would you say in Korach's defense? Go ahead.
He was elected by the community.
Yes, so these people were elected by the community, right? That's what it says, chiefs of the community elected in the assembly.
They were people
Of repute, it says, right, yes, exactly. And when was Moses elected? Right, Moses wasn't elected. So from the point of view of democracy, this is terrible, right? Okay, yes.
I'm just asking a question here.
Yes.
No.
I say, okay, Korach. Okay, as Korach's lawyer, Korach is saying, what are you talking about rebelling? I'm just asking a question here, right? You claim to be the leader. You claim to have the authorization of God to be this, but God said that we were all holy. So why do you and Aaron claim to be the only ones with leadership authority? Good. That's one way in which, that's a second way in which the lawyer for Korach might defend him. What's another? Yes.
Well, Abraham negotiated with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, so
Right.
why isn't it okay for him to negotiate?
Exactly.
Or to negotiate with Moses? He's
Hey,
only a person.
Exactly. Moses, I mean, grow up. Abraham argued even with God, And did God say that arguing with God was, would lead you to be killed? No, quite the contrary. In the Sodom and Gomorrah story, God was very happy that Abraham argued with him. As a matter of fact, accepted his arguments. Right? And Moses, Moses, argued with God, right, to defend the people of Israel after the golden calf incident and after the spy incident. Did God get rid of you? No, quite the contrary. God listened to you. So why shouldn't you listen to, if God is willing to listen to human beings, why shouldn't you, as a human being, be willing to listen to other human beings? Especially members of this community who are also holy. God said so. Right? Good arguments. Any others on behalf of Korach? Yes?
Would I be cruel and unusual punishment?
Yes, that's right. Even if we sinned in saying that you shouldn't be the leader, being swallowed up by the earth, this is all before Hollywood, right? So, the new 007 movie is out, right? The new James Bond movie is out. What is it, 27th or 20? Spectre, yeah, it's the 27th or 29th or something. Right there you expect these kinds of pyrotechnics, right? But this is in the Torah. And even if we were guilty of doing something wrong, which is not clear, I'm still, I'm the attorney for Korach here, even if my clients were guilty, which is still not clear, the death penalty for asking you about your leadership qualifications and why should you be the only ones? And isn't this yes, go ahead.
I have a question. This happened when the earth swallowed them. Was it before they were talking to Moses, had a chance to talk to God?
Well,
I don't know when it was. It was before.
Well, it's at the end of the story, right? The earth opens up and swallows them up at the end of the story. It was too late anyway. Yeah, that's right. So maybe.
The punishment happened. What are you arguing?
I see. Okay. But the point is that but I think what Korach, I understand what you're saying, but what Korach's lawyers might say is even if you think that God think that we did something wrong, the punishment shouldn't be so terrible, right? Because first of all, how do we know that we were doing anything wrong? After all, you told us that we were part of this holy people, so shouldn't we have some status as part of this holy people? Right? Yes?
There isn't anything in this story, and this is the first time I'm reading it, by the way.
Okay.
That says that he even knew that any punishment was coming.
Exactly.
He just thought it unquestionable.
That's right.
I was elected, I have a right to ask.
Yes. So
He didn't know he was going to be slaughtered.
yes. So that's another problem with this. If they are going to be punished, it's ex post facto punishment, banned by the American Constitution, right? So how can do you understand what I'm saying? Because there was no law ahead of time saying everything that Moses says you have to do. Nowhere, right? And certainly not before this story. So the issue then becomes, Deuteronomy sounds like that in a certain way, but that's Moses talking, and he's saying, if you follow everything that I tell you, then all things will be good for you. But if you don't follow what I'm telling you, then things will be bad for you. But that's Deuteronomy. That comes later. That's the 5th book in the Torah. We're in the 4th book here, right? And so the punishment comes, first of all, without any advance notice that this is a crime to begin with, and without any advance notice that the punishment for the crime, if you commit it, is this. So this is ex post facto justice, which is, God should be better than that. Yes?
We also had a precedent in Exodus, if they knew about it, of people kvetching and arguing, and many of them were punished for that, but they were following
Yeah.
in their footsteps of their forebears.
Right. The people of Israel, this is no surprise to you, I would imagine, right? The people of Israel are not used to just being passively accepting things, right? For a number of years, I did a program for the Anti-Defamation League called Bearing Witness. It was for teachers in Catholic high schools, most of whom themselves are Catholic. And this was, and ADL's interest was to get Catholics to understand that the Church did not really step up the way they should have stepped up during the Second World War, but then also to talk about what happened with the Second Vatican Council that completely revolutionized Catholic-Jewish relations. and what happened subsequently, Pope John Paul II calling anti-Semitism a sin, and, a number of things that have happened. I mean, my father would call this Mashiach side, right? Messianic times. My father was born in Poland and said that he thought that Poles imbibed anti-Semitism with their mother's milk, right? And then when Vatican II happened, I mean, he really didn't understand it. I mean, because those were, and a Polish Pope no less, right, later on, right? So this is, but what it turns out to be is also Judaism 101 for a lot of these people. I'm almost always the first rabbi they've ever met, certainly the first rabbi they've ever talked to, and in some cases the first Jew they've ever met, right? And and I do this with Father Dennis McManus, who is a really smart and wonderful man. He's a professor at Georgetown. His field is patristics, and he is the liaison of the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops to the Vatican. So he's in Rome every other month for about 2 weeks, and he knew all of the popes personally, and he knows a lot of the cardinals. I mean, and we became very good friends, and he would tell me a lot of the dirt, frankly, of, of the Vatican. Anyway, he says to his fellow Catholics, we Catholics are good at reception. We receive what we are told. At which point I tell them Jews are terrible at reception, right? We question everything. And that's not new with us, right? That goes back to Abraham questioning God at Sodom and Gomorrah, Moses, questioning God later on, Isaiah questions God, Jeremiah questions God, Job questions God, Ecclesiastes questions God, right? All of these people in the Bible question God. And then when you get to the Talmud, the Talmud is one page after another of arguments, right? So we accept almost nothing on face value. I once actually did there was a series of issues, a series of talks at the Brentwood Presbyterian Church on Sunday mornings. They had services either at 9 or at 11. And when you're a Presbyterian, services last for how long? 1 hour, of course. So between 10 and 11, I do a lot of interfaith work. I once did a thing for evangelical Christian leaders, and during a break one time I said to them, the best thing you guys have going for you is a 1 hour service, right? Because how bad could that be, right? And one of them said to me, trust me, it can be really bad, right? But anyway, the thing is this, I told them, this, so from 10 to 11, they had this adult education series. So if you came to the service at 9, you would stay on. If you were coming to the service at 11, you come early at 10 for this adult education thing. And they had this series on the religions of the world, and I was Judaism, all right? So, so the thing is, Judaism in an hour. So one of the things that I talked about was this. I said, one of the things you have to get to know about Judaism, aside from the theological things I'll tell you about in just a moment, is the very tone of the tradition is argumentative. It's a very feisty tradition. It loves argument and doesn't see that at all as disrespectful. Quite the opposite. If you respect the other party enough, then you will in fact argue with the other party, because then you'll presume that the other party will argue back, right? And you have enough respect for the party to presume that the other party will not just sit there and accept it, right? So after that was over, this man came up to me. He was in his late 50s, and he told me that he was an aeronautical engineer. At that time, it was at TRW. Now it's Northrop Grumman, right? He was an aeronautical engineer at TRW. And he said, now I understand something. I said, what do you understand? He said, in all my years, he had been at TRW for like 40 years, right? In all my years at TRW, the only time when I raised the question about why we were doing things and suggested that we do things in a different way, the only time I wasn't shut down was when I had a Jewish boss. Which is really interesting, isn't it? I mean, it really is in the culture where you get to question things. So the one defense argument here might be, come on, Moses, you know who we are. Right? You know what this culture is. You know what our leaders have done. You yourself have argued with God. So what's so bad about arguing with you? Right? You should be able to take you should be able to take it and come back with your counter arguments. Yes.
Yeah, but Cork might say, look, you were kind of a reluctant leader to begin with.
There you go.
I mean, it wasn't as though
We're doing you a favor.
Yeah.
Okay, right?
You kind of didn't really want this role,
That's right.
and so I'm here to step up.
To step up and take over, right? You did what God told you to do. You took us out of Egypt,
Yeah.
right? You didn't want this. Retire. We'll take over, right? Right? You can. I mean, the point is that you can certainly understand. Forget the rest of the story, because the rest of the story comes from an author that really thinks these people are terrible because they rebelled against Moses, right? But if you simply look at their argument, you could interpret it in any one of these ways, right? Which would not make them all that bad.
Right.
Yes, did you want to say? Go ahead.
But you can't be addressing these arguments to Moses. Moses wasn't the one who tore the ground asunder.
No, but Moses is the one. Look what Moses does. When Moses heard this, he fell on his face. And then he spoke to Korach and his company, saying, "Come morning, the Lord will make known who is his and who is holy, and will grant him access to himself. He will grant access to the one he has chosen. You bring your paraphernalia with you tomorrow, and we'll see what God says." Right? And he didn't have to do that. He didn't have to go back to the king, as it were. Right? Pardon me?
You didn't have to go back to the source.
No, he could have said, if he were really a leader, right? And by the way, it's plenty of other times, right, in the Torah, things are brought up to him, and sometimes he goes back to the source. Sometimes, like with the story of the daughters of Tzlafchad,
But what
right?
about the story of Saul and the Amalekites, where Saul chooses not to kill all of the
Right.
Amalekites? He chose to do it because he was the king, and God was upset with him.
Yes, but that's because God, at least as Samuel has it, right? That God gave him direct instructions not to do that, right? Here, we're not talking about, there weren't any direct instructions. Here, we just have the story that Moses is the leader. God chose him. Moses was reluctant to be the leader. He goes up the mountain, he comes back, he goes up the mountain, comes back again, and now they're often not running, but they're often walking, yes, through the desert. And these people come up and say to him, now, the problem is we don't know what the tone is of these words, right? But you could at least interpret these words as saying, we're not looking out for ourselves. We're just simply saying that if we take God seriously, and we really are a holy people, then it shouldn't be a dictatorship, right? It should be a democracy. And that's exactly, yes, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, okay, so Moses says, all right, I'm going to check with God and see what he thinks about this. So why did God take such a...
Yeah. Why should God be so...
God could have just said, listen to Moses.
Yes, that's exactly right. So, there are several problems here. Number one, it didn't seem to be against the law to begin with to suggest to Moses that there be, a distribution of leadership. For that matter, there was a precedent for that. Remember Exodus chapter 18. Moses is judging cases all day long, and his father-in-law, Jethro, comes to him and says, delegate, right? That's basically what he says to them, right? Appoint other kinds of judges, let them do most of the work, and ultimately, if they need a Supreme Court, they'll come to you. But delegate. All they're saying here is delegate. Delegate not only the functions, delegate also the leadership functions. So, there's even a precedent in the Torah for what they're asking Moses to do. Why did Moses respond to Korach so vehemently when he didn't respond to his father-in-law that way? And his father-in-law wasn't even Jewish.
So what is the purpose of this story being put in?
I want to do two other things, and then please ask that question again after I do these next two things, okay? Take a look at what the Interpreter's Bible says. The reason why I gave this story to you in Living Tree is because I wanted you to see these two interpretations of it. It's on page 232, okay, 232, where you just left off the passage from the Torah. Consider this exposition of Albert George Butzer in the Interpreter's Bible. And if you will, just take a moment to read the paragraph.
If someone reads it out loud.
Okay. Somebody like to read it out loud? Please do.
All right. From our present vantage point, we certainly cannot be too severely critical of Korah and Abiram. To Today we glory in their two main contentions vis-a-vis ecclesiastical and political democracy as over against autocracy in both of these realms.
Did you understand that? Now, in our own day, we believe in both that there be democracy both in political things and in synagogue-related things or religion-related things, right? Rather than autocracy. So, go ahead.
So, in what then did the crime of Korah and his associates consist? Was it not that they failed to see that their timing was wrong?
Go, keep on.
Fine as their ideas were, they would not understand that the people of Israel were not ready for them. Indeed, had the rebellion of Korah succeeded at that time, the result would have been the worst kind of chaos, and God's plan for Israel would have been dealt a retardingly disastrous blow. There is destructive power in an idea whose time has not come.
So, you don't like that. Okay, fine. But let's make sure everybody understands what he's saying. His claim is that, what looks like us to be very much like the American Revolution, actually, and very much like James Madison's Federalist Papers, right? Basically saying that every kind of government has its problems, but democracies have fewer problems than other kinds of governments, and certainly what you want is separation of powers, right? You want real separation of powers because they will then be checks on each other, and that will be the best kind of guarantee we can get that this human institution called the government will not go astray. There are no guarantees in life, but at least if you have separation of powers, you have a better chance of having a good government, as opposed to an autocracy with just one person in charge, right? Whether that be a king or a dictator or somebody else, right? Chieftain, whatever. So the claim, that's the claim. And what Butzer says is, this is a claim that, certainly for Americans, it should sound very good. So what's wrong with it in this context?
He's dealing with a political institution
Right.
rather than an institution, a religion based on.
Well, he's claiming that even in religion, Americans would say, and it's true, by the way, of most American religions, right, Catholicism being an exception to the rule, but if you're talking about religions that really took hold in America, it's primarily Protestantism, and Protestantism is really not based on bishops and that kind of stuff. I mean, you have it in Catholicism, you have it in Episcopalianism, which was basically from England, but the Methodists and the Lutherans and the Presbyterians, let alone the Baptists and the Anabaptists and so on, they all are not at all interested in that kind of church hierarchy.
How about the Mormons?
The Mormons are a whole other matter, right? But even they, they have a council of elders, right? It's not one. And it's there are real issues there, right? But even for them, it's not one autocrat, basically, right? So what then was the problem? According to Butzer, it was a time that had not come. What does he mean by that?
Well, he's claiming that it would be chaos.
Right.
It was just wrong timing.
What do you think he means that it would lead to chaos?
Well, because it would now have conflict of leadership.
Right. And why was that wrong in that context?
Well, they were just out of slavery,
Right.
and they were used to not making independent decisions.
Right.
And now suddenly there's this group that's forming that wants to make an independent decision, and they're fearful now that this is going to lead to maybe another group will now step up.
That's right.
Make another
And-
independent decision, and it would be chaotic.
That's right. And this is especially problematic because what were they about to do?
Well, entering the
Enter the land of Israel. And they were not going to enter with, fanfare or anything like that. They were going to have to fight in order to conquer the land. And so in a military context, you don't want democracy, right? You want democracy in a civil context. You don't want it in a military context. So that, I think, is what he's after, right? It's not so much that the time hadn't come, it's that the context was the wrong context, right? That they were about to fight for taking over the land of Canaan, and you can't run a campaign like that based upon democratic principles. It's the same problem, by the way, that we have in America with the military leadership versus the civilian leadership. The whole notion of having a Secretary of Defense who's a member of the civilian government, right, who has power over the military leaders, the Secretary of the Army and of the Navy and of the Air Force and so on down the line, right? That whole notion is a very new notion with the United States, right? I mean, until the United States, the military leader was also the civilian leader. It was true for kings and queens. It was true for Napoleon, right? It was true for the caliphs of the Arab rule, right? I mean, the military leader, it was true for Rome, certainly. The military, there was no distinction between the military leader and the civilian leader. That whole notion is really a function of the Enlightenment. And ultimately, I mean, it is of people like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but the political manifestation of this only comes with the United States, right? I mean, even in France, in the French Revolution, they had a lot of trouble. They had the guillotine, right? Remember that? So, I mean, this whole notion that we as Americans take for granted of separation of powers, first of all, we take it for granted in civilian context. We really don't fight wars that way. Even we don't fight wars that way. And so Butcher's point here, I think, is that a nice idea for civilian life, not a good idea for a people that was about to try to carry on a military campaign to conquer Canaan. Take a look at Martin Buber. You may want to read the paragraph that introduces that I wrote. In contrast, Martin Buber. Martin Buber is writing in the 1930s and in Germany. And what's going on in the 1930s in Germany? The Nazis have come to power in 1933. Okay, and there are a number of Nazis who are basically roaming the streets and stealing things and harming people, killing people, all of that, right? So that's the background. Take a moment and read, starting with In Contrast, Martin Buber at the bottom of page 232, and then 233, including Buber's words. It goes to the top of 235. What is he saying? What is Buber saying? Do you know, by the way, let me just say a little bit about Martin Buber. He was among the leaders of the Lehrhaus in Berlin. The Lehrhaus was an institution that was created by him and by Franz Rosenzweig after the First World War for adult Jewish education. And among the things they did was to translate the Bible into contemporary German so that adult Germans could understand it. And they created a way of learning which was very interactional. Later on, Martin Buber wrote a number of books. One of them was called I and Thou, right, in which the point was that even though the classical literature talks about how we as a community relate to God, ultimately it is the individual that relates to God and relates to other human beings. And he uses the relationship that each of us has with God as the paradigm of what a deep relationship should look like between one individual and another. We don't have a lot of those. We don't have time or effort, or energy for a lot of such relationships, but we all have some, or at least most of us have some such relationships with a spouse, with children, with parents, with your two closest friends, that kind of thing. Might be I-thou relationships, in terms of where the point of the relationship is not to get something done. The point of the relationship is simply to enjoy each other's company and to do things together, right? That's an I-thou relationship. And he's very interested in making Judaism modern. He's very interested in making Judaism relate to a modern adult, at that time, German Jews. And the way that he did it was through making the tradition accessible to all Germans, to all German Jews. He fled from Germany in 1936, I think it was, something like that, to Israel. And when he was in Israel, he was among those that were in the forefront of trying to make peace between the Jews and the Arabs, and ultimately died in Israel in 55, I think it was, something like that. Okay, what does he say here? How does he understand the Korach story? Korach and his band are dangerous. Why are they dangerous?
Because they want to go against what is considered the structure that has been set up.
Right, that word that I just described to you before. They were antinomian, right? You're not, I would imagine most people are not going to take graduate record exams. But anyway, it's a word that might very well be on a graduate record exam. Antinomian, right? Anti, against. Nomos is the Greek word for a norm or for a rule. So antinomian means people who are against having rules, right? Who want people to simply be able to run free and do whatever they want, right? That's why he calls them werewolves and leopards, right? Because he's thinking of the brown shirts, the Nazi brown shirts that are running around Germany at the time in the mid-1930s and stealing from people at will and killing people or harming them at will, right? Who just had the anniversary of Kristallnacht a little while ago. You know, that was the brown shirts that did that. And it was, and so he sees the Korach and his band as if they were like the Nazi brown shirts. And so the problem with them is not that they wanted democracy when what you needed was a military kind of style of leadership. That was Butzer's view, right? The problem with Korach and his band is that they were completely antinomian, right? They didn't want any kind of rules whatsoever. Now, it's interesting that the next thing that as you can see from the top of the page, this is in a part of the book that Arthur and I put together, which is about opposition movements to Rabbinic Judaism. One of those opposition movements, of course, was Korach. That was already in biblical times. But in Rabbinic times, Christianity begins, right? And there were two kinds of Christianity that developed from the 1st century to the 5th century or so. One was called the Hebrew Christians. These were the followers of Peter, who were largely Jews, and who believed that Jewish law should continue unabated. It should still be authoritative. And the only thing that the only part in which they disagreed with the Jewish tradition was that they believed that Jesus was the Messiah. That's not a small thing, okay? But they believed that Jesus was the promised Messiah, but that Jewish law was still binding, okay? So it was a theological difference. It was not a legal difference. Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, and Paul realized very early on that if he was going to tell, the Romans and the Ephesians and the Galatians and all the rest of the various nations that he was visiting, that they were going to have to abide by Jewish law, and in particular that the men were going to have to be circumcised, it was a no-go, okay, right? It was just simply not going to happen. So he had to find a way to say that, if the law was given by God, it was still good, but it's no longer authoritative. And he does this in his letter to the Romans, chapters 7 to 11, in which he gives the following sort of analogy. If a couple is married, then the obligations that they have to each other continue on through the marriage. But if one of them dies, then through no fault of either one of them, the covenant of marriage ceases. Okay? So Jesus came to die for our sins, and Christian interpreters interpret this in two different ways. Is it God that died? The covenant is between God and the Jewish people. So it's the Jewish people that died when Jesus dies, or is it God that died when Jesus died? But anyway, Jesus came to die for our sins, so now the covenant of law is no longer operative. And what comes instead is the covenant of the Spirit. This is Paul in Romans chapter 7 to 11. It's very close. It's very close to what Buber is talking about in regard to Korach and his band. At least if you understand this as that the problem was antinomianism, right? The problem was no laws. By the way, what happened even in Paul's life? He goes to the Galatians, and they hear that this guy wants no laws. But then he has to say, oh, no. This is Galatians chapter 3. No. By living by the Spirit, I didn't mean you do whatever you want. But life by the Spirit means not debauchery and killing people and harming people and that kind of stuff. Living by the Spirit means, and then all kinds of wonderful things. Okay? But he basically is simply replacing the laws that required those things with now saying the Spirit requires these things, right? And what later happened in the history of Christianity is, of course, Christian countries had to have laws and all of this kind of stuff, right? And so you give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and you give to God that which is God's, right? That was their, that Jesus says this in the Gospels, right? That was their ultimate, their ultimate way of dealing with this. Although the relationship of Jesus to the law is much more complicated, because in Matthew he says he doesn't come to change a jot or a tittle of the law, right? So Jesus and Jesus is called a rabbi 20-some times in the Gospels, right? So he clearly was part of the rabbinic tradition. And it may have been just his disciple Paul who interpreted him to want to say that with the coming of Jesus, the law should no longer be authoritative, right? But the fact that the Christianity that you know and I know doesn't believe that all of those laws of the Torah, with the exception of the Ten Commandments, are authoritative, that's the Christianity that's the product of Paul, not the product of Jesus, really. But it's very much open to the same charge that Buber makes against Korach, the charge of antinomianism. Okay? Let's look at another story in the Torah where Moses again has trouble, but this is a different story again, which my guess is you may have read it before, but again, it's not one that is nearly as familiar as most of the stories of the Torah and the Bible that you could sort of just reel off. This is Numbers chapter 11. Numbers, again, is the fourth book of the 5 in the Torah. So this is another book. It comes page 224 on the bottom of the page. It looks like this, with a big 11 toward the bottom. Right? 224, it's got a big 11 toward the bottom of the page. Okay? Because this is chapter 11 in the book of Numbers. Take a moment and read it, if you will. Starting with chapter 11. The people took to complaining. Okay. How many of you are vegetarians? Maybe the story will make you one, but anyway. All right. The people were complaining bitterly before the Lord. What else is new? Okay, right. By the way, if you read the New Testament, you never get complaints, right? You get stories of miracles and all of that kind of thing. I'm not suggesting you to be Christian. Don't leave this room and say, Dorff said, right, that the Gospels are better than the Torah. Definitely not, okay? But what's interesting is that in the Torah you get real people. I mean, you get people with all of their faults, including what's going on here. The people are complaining before the Lord because they only have this vegetarian diet, right, which comes down every night, this coriander seed. And it's interesting, the rabbis later say that despite this passage where they're complaining about it, the great thing about this coriander seed is that it would taste however you wanted it to taste, right? So, I mean, if you wanted meat that day and you ate this coriander seed, it tasted like meat. If you wanted fish, it tasted like fish. If you wanted Jell-O, it tasted like Jell-O, right? Okay, right. Okay. They were, they wanted meat, and You know, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish that we used to eat free in Egypt. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. Right? What is the story about the people in Egypt? They were slaves. Guess what they ate? Coriander seed. No, right? What they ate was certainly not this. Right? I mean, what they are imagining is that how good it was back there. Right? But they were imagining things that just never happened. And now we have only this manna, this thing that comes down every, like dew every evening, and we gather it up together, we make it, we boil it, we make it into cakes, but that's all we've got, right? Now, and we want some variety in our diet. So Moses heard the people weeping, every clan apart, and what is his reaction to this? It's not about the claim that they're making.
He couldn't take it anymore.
I can't take it anymore. It's enough already. I didn't want this job in the first place, right? And you forced it on me. And I'm supposed to be the only one that bears all of these complaints, right? My wife and I have 4 children, and every once in a while, I would hear, right? It's your turn to take care of the kids, right? Right, yes. And we actually worked out a system where when the kids were young, before 7 o'clock on Shabbos morning, she had them. And then at 7 o'clock, she got to go back to bed, and I had them until we went to shul. And then in the we split the afternoons also, right? Right. This is called, keeping sanity. Or marriage, that's right, yes. But we were able to work it out, and it was all fine, because you knew that you didn't have them alone all the time. Right? And I frankly pity single parents, to be very honest. I mean, I think it's very hard. But anyway, that's what Moses is saying. Did I conceive all this people? Did I bear them? And you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries an infant to the land you have promised on oath to their fathers. Where am I to get meat to give all these people? When they whine before me and say, give us meat to eat. I cannot carry all these people myself. It's too much for me. If you would deal with these people, kill me rather. I'd rather die than have to bear all these people, right? Now, you can imagine, that this is said in a fit of rage, well, first of all, of rage, but also of complete frustration, right? I just can't do this anymore. So God answers both parts of the issue. One part of the issue is Moses' complaint that he doesn't want to do this on his own. And the other is this issue of meat. So the part of the complaint that he doesn't want to do this anymore, what does God do with that? He gets a group, 70 elders, okay? Yes, exactly. Now notice, this is chapter 11 of Numbers, right? The Korach story is what chapter? 16. So again, the question is there, the rabbis will later say, Ein mukdam u'muchar b'Torah. There's nothing earlier and later in the Torah. That, right? In other words, you can't, well, they wouldn't put it this way, but I would say you can't trust the chronology. Okay? That things that are recorded in the Torah as being one before the other might have been in the opposite order. That's how the rabbis will later see this kind of thing, right? Because the way that we have it, by the time you get to Korach, there were already 70 elders. That were and Moses and Aaron were not the only ones who were running the show. There were 70 other people who were doing it. So that makes the placing of the Korach story very problematic, unless you presume that the order of the stories in the Torah is not necessarily the order in which they occurred. And that makes a lot of sense if you remember that the Torah, it consists of stories and laws that were originally in oral form, right? They were originally they were handed down, as stories that were told around the fire at night, right, from one generation to the next. Why were they not in written form? All right, so first of all, it was hard to get writing materials, right? In the ancient world, if you wanted to write something down on the most convenient thing possible, your grocery list, let's say, but one that you didn't need for a very long time, what would you write on? No, stone would be really hard. Clay. You just take some mud and, and write into that, right? Second easiest thing to write would be on paper, but in the ancient Near East, they didn't know about how to get paper from wood. They didn't have that technology, and aside from that, there weren't a lot of trees, right, in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. So when they had paper, they would get it from papyrus, from reeds, right? But then you have to grow the reeds, you have to cut the reeds, you have to dry them out, right? And then you have to get ink. Where would you get ink from? From the store, I know. But where would you get? Right. No, not from blood, usually. Pardon me?
Indigo.
Yeah, but where would you get it? I mean, it's primarily from fruits and nuts. But especially in the ancient world, the gall nut, G-A-L-L, the gall nut was the most popular because the meat of the gall nut is black rather than brown. So the contrast between the ink that you got from the gall nut and the underlying paper would be greater, therefore it would be easier to read, right, than if you had brown ink or something like that. So clay and then paper, and then the next easiest thing to use, also it would last longer, would be, yes, and parchment comes from? Animal skins, that's right. But then you have to raise the animal, you have to slaughter the animal, you have to skin the animal, you have to dry out the skin, right? I mean, it's a whole big deal, right? And you still use gall nut juice to write on. That's exactly a Sefer Torah, right? A Torah scroll is a parchment, right? It's an animal skin that has been treated in a certain sort of way. And by the way, Sephardim are able to write a full, if you hire somebody who knows how to write a Torah, a sofer, a scribe, and you prepare the skin the way that the Sephardim do, it takes about a year to write a full-time work to write a Sefer Torah. If you prepare the skin the way Ashkenazim do, it takes a year and 3 months, right? It's just because of the way, and have you ever seen a Torah scroll, a Sephardic Torah scroll? It's darker, right? And it's therefore actually harder to read. But in order to make it whiter, you have to treat it for a much longer period of time, right? So that would be animal skins, and then of course the hardest thing to write on was stone. But so as a result, most of this tradition was not written down altogether. It was told around the fire, or it was some of the laws were simply things that you saw going on in your society. And I would suggest to you that the oral tradition is still alive and well today, even in modern America, certainly with books, but now e-books and email and Facebook and all of that kind of stuff, right? And a literacy rate in America, whatever it is, 95% or something, right? Even with that, the oral tradition is alive and well. I'll give you an example. When you turned 16, how many of you knew that you could not drive a car until you turned 16 and took a driver's test by reading it in your state's motor vehicle code? I doubt it. What you read was what the DMV gave you, right? And what the DMV gave you, in California anyway, is written on a 5th grade reading level with pictures, okay? And it is, right, and it is maybe a 20th of the size of the motor vehicle code, right? If you ever see the California motor vehicle code, I have a friend actually who carries it around in his car. So in case he is stopped by a police officer, he brings it out and he says, "Show me," right? He has gotten off of some tickets that way, I must say, right? Right. And those of you who are not lawyers, any of you here lawyers? Okay, so if you're not lawyers, then how many of you have ever read the Code of Laws of the State of California? How many of you have ever read, you may have read the Constitution of America in U.S. history a long time ago, right? But the Code of Laws of the State of California, it's volumes. How many of you have ever read the Code of Laws of the United States of America? So if you don't know the law, how are you law-abiding citizens? Maybe you're not, See, that's what you came here to find out tonight, right? But as soon as you turned 18, if you were born in this country, as soon as you turned 18, you became responsible for every single law in those codes, right? Now, how does the state might have the power to enforce its laws, but how does it have the right, the moral right, to enforce its laws? The answer to that question depends upon whether you're reading Hobbes or Locke or a variety of other people, but by and large, it's because if you grew up in this country and you learned how people operate in this country, then the state can presume you know enough about the laws of this country to hold you responsible. That's the oral tradition, right? Alive and well in our own time, even with printed books and e-books and all of that, right? All the more so in the ancient world. So the fact that these stories may be out of order is not at all surprising, because they're out of order once they were ultimately written down. But the order in the Torah doesn't necessarily mean that that was the order in which they happened. So it's quite possible that even though Korach is Numbers chapter 16 and this story is Numbers chapter 11, right, that they happened in the flip order, because the Korach story presumes that it's only Moses and Aaron that are running the show. And in this chapter, all of a sudden we've got a council of 70 elders, right? Now, how that council functioned is anyone's guess. I mean, we don't know whether, Moses made a decision and the council made another decision, and, Moses said, no, I trump you. Not the Donald Trump, no, I mean, I supersede you. I'm sorry, I really didn't mean that. Right? I mean, we don't know. I mean, maybe Moses had ultimate authority over this, right? Certainly by the time you get to the Samuel and Saul stories that I think you mentioned before, right? Samuel very much does not want the people of Israel to have a king, right? Because he says to them, the king will make all kinds of rules. They'll take your money. The kings will force you into corvée labor, right? The kings will do all of these kinds of things. And the kings will effectively take away your right to make any of the laws, right? And yet, the people want a king. Now, notice you don't get a king in the Torah at all, except when you get to Deuteronomy, and where Deuteronomy then says, if you will appoint a king on yourself, then first of all, the king has to make a copy of the Torah. This is Deuteronomy chapter 17. The king has to make a copy of the Torah and have it with him at all times to make it clear to him that the Torah governs over him, right? But it's sort of like in American law. The Constitution governs all of the authorities in the country, including the president, right? But that's not what it was in most other countries in the ancient world. In any case, my point here is that this story about appointing elders probably came after the Korach story, and what we still don't know with this story is what their role is. Do you remember the Jethro story back in Exodus chapter 18? Moses is judging all day long, and his father-in-law, who's not Jewish, says to him, too much of a burden, delegate, right? There, at least, we know how it operated, because there were judges for the tens and judges for the hundreds and judges for the thousands, and presumably the judges for the hundreds had veto power over the judges of the tens. In other words, it was an appellate sort of system. And the one who was the ultimate judge was Moses. So when they didn't know, when you had what we would call circuit courts that come with different judgments, then ultimately the Supreme Court makes the decision in the American system, and in the Jewish system that Jethro laid out, you would have these local courts and then regional courts, and then but it wasn't done by area; it was done by numbers. Courts for tens, courts for hundreds, courts for thousands, and then ultimately Moses was the Supreme Court. There, at least, you knew how these judges operated and who had authority over whom. Here, you have no clue.
Can you explain that? A judge of 10, traffic tickets, a judge of 100, murder, or what?
Well, later the Mishnah, edited around the year 200, has a whole different system of courts. And there are three levels of courts: courts of 3, courts of 23, and courts of 71, right? And those courts have different levels of jurisdiction. So capital cases had to be judged by a court of 23. Civil cases, money problems, were judged by a court of 3. And national issues, whether you go to war or whether a particular community was idolatrous or something like that, right? National issues were decided by a court of 71. That's in the Mishnah. Here, you've got these 70 elders, and we have no idea how they function.
Let me ask you, is the Sanhedrin 70 also?
Yeah, the Sanhedrin was 70, but they added 1. Why? It came out of this. That's right. It came out of the 70 elders. That's right. That's where the number 71 came from. Why did they add 1? That's right. So in order to break a tie. Exactly right. Okay? All right. So there were 2 complaints. One was, why are you the only ones that are, that are ruling here? That was Moses' complaint to God. And then there was the people's complaint, we don't have meat. To which, what happens? God gives them meat with a vengeance, right? To the point where they die of it, okay? This is all before cholesterol was known, right? This is all before, right? But the point is that the way that the Torah presents this is intended to give you what lesson? Too much of one thing is no good, right? And even if you believe that that meat is the ultimate food, too much of it is no good. As my grandmother used to say, an apple a day will keep the doctor away, but 10 of them will bring him running. All right? Okay. An apple a day will keep the doctor away, but 10 of them will bring him running. That's what my grandmother used to say. 2-2, that's what the other thing she used to say. T-O-O, T-O-O, right? Things are too. They're too much, right? And what you get here, I think, the other lesson here, I think, is that God may know best, right? May know best, right? In other words, even though you think that this manna is terrible, right? You're going through the desert, and maybe going through the desert is a situation in which eating meat is not a healthy thing to do. Right? Because what's the desert like? Anybody ever been in? Yes, it's very dry, right? It's hot. It's not the kind of situation in which eating meat is a very healthy thing to do altogether, right? Yes?
Is this sort of like where, the people want a king, so he says, I'm going to give you a king. I'm going to give you Saul, and he was a bad king. I'll teach you a lesson.
Right.
And this is sort of the same thing. I'll give you what you ask for, and I'll show you that it may
not be so great.
Up to be.
Yes, exactly right. And it's a very, but notice the Game of Thrones theme here, right? The people are rebelling against Moses, again, right? And Moses doesn't, just put them down. In the case of Korach, Moses gets God to get rid of them, right? In this case, what happens is that Moses basically gives up, right? And he says, I can't lead this people anymore. Enough, right? At which point God says, all right, I'll get you help. But notice what's going on here. You don't have in the figure Moses a kind of, you guys ever read Nietzsche? Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is a 19th century German philosopher, and he talks about that we shouldn't be looking for slave morality, we should be looking for noble morality. And who is the nobleman? The nobleman is the one who rules everybody else and gets rid of all comers, right? Gets rid of all competition. This is not Moses. From the very beginning, he didn't want to be a leader, right? And now that he's in the leadership role, he's not always sure what to do, right? He goes back to God a number of times to say, what should I do now? And in this story, he goes back to God and says, get rid of this leadership role for me. I'm not your guy, right? I'm not the one who wanted this position in the first place, and I'm not, and I shouldn't have it. And it's interesting that it's this reluctant leader that turns out to be the major figure in the Torah. In some ways, and this is going to be a really wild analogy, but in some ways this is exactly the story in Plato's Republic. Because what Plato says is that the ultimate leader should be the philosopher king who doesn't want to be king, the philosopher who doesn't want to be king. And that what you really want is a leader that is reluctant to be a leader, but in the end really knows how. Now compare that to the debates that we're watching today. Right? Okay, right. And I'll let you decide which is wiser. But Moses is certainly our teacher, as the rabbis talked about him. Moses is also, though, against his will, the leader of the people for 2 generations, actually. Right? The generation that comes out of Egypt and they die in the desert, and then the second generation he's still the leader of until they get to the River Jordan and Joshua takes over. Right? So this is a job he gets reluctantly for 2 generations. And it's interesting to see that he never relishes it. He never even in the Korach story, he never defends his own leadership position. God does ultimately, but he doesn't. He says, wait and we'll see what God says. Maybe I shouldn't be the leader anymore. Right? It's a really interesting model of who our leader ought to be. All right, one last thing and then we have to stop.
If he was so against being a leader, and he had this Korach that was dying to be a leader, why didn't he give it to him?
Yeah, exactly right. That's one of the things that doesn't make sense in the story. Right, she asked if he didn't want to be leader from the very beginning, and now you have Korach and his 250 people who want to be the leader, why didn't he just say, Gesundheit, hey?
Yeah.
Right?
Because that was not his position to do.
Yes, because and I think that's exactly right. I think the answer to your question is that he never acquired leadership on his own. He was appointed leader by God. Right? And therefore he goes to God, after they say, why are you guys the leaders? Shouldn't all of us be leaders? So he goes back to the source. He goes back to God and says, maybe they're right. Yeah, but I think the reason why he didn't say that is because he didn't feel that he had the authority to say that. Right? To God, that's right. God appointed him to begin with, so he's got to ultimately get... Yes, but he got God to give them meat, right? No, he says to God, where am I going to get meat from?
Yeah, right.
Right? So ultimately he goes back to the source because you, God, are responsible for my being the leader. It's your headache.
So the purpose of this being in the Torah is?
Yeah, good question. The purpose of this being in the Torah. What are you supposed to learn from this, do you think?
That God and leaderships are not infallible.
Yes. And I think also that that leaders are not intended to see themselves as being infallible, right? And that leaders are to take only those positions that are really for the good of the people and not necessarily good for themselves, right? And what you have in Moses is a reluctant leader who nevertheless takes on the position in part because God forces him to, and in part because he thinks that this people needs to be defended.
And he never benefits from it personally.
Definitely not. No palaces here, no Maseratis or whatever, right? Or the equivalent thereof in the ancient world, right? No benefits whatsoever. See, later on, Samuel will say to the people, you don't want a king, because among the other things they will do is tax you and take your money away. Right? But you don't get that in Moses at all. There is a taxation in the stories in the Torah, but what does that do? What is the taxation for?
The temple.
For the temple. So that's not for him. Okay?
The best way to have a leader that doesn't have any compensation.
Yes, the leader that has no compensation. Try to get one of those. Okay, right. Yes.
In the book of Numbers, we didn't talk about this, but Moses said you guys, you're sons of Levi, and isn't it enough that you're Levites, that you have this, you're in this special group already?
Right.
And then he says, you want to be priests too?
Yes.
And he's like, why are you doing this to Aaron?
Yes. Exactly right. Yes, you know, and this is an interfamilial struggle, as you understand, right? So, Aaron was of the tribe of Levi, but Aaron's children, Aaron's male descendants, were priests, whereas the rest of the tribe of Levi were Levi'im. So who were the Levi'im? They ultimately assisted the priests in the temple, but they themselves were not priests. They did not have the authority to do certain things in the temple. They were only the assistants, right? And so the question is, you're not happy with being second in command. You want to be first in command. That's really what it boils down to, right? My grandfather was a Levi, so I inherit this feeling. No, not at all. It was my grandfather on my mother's side, so I'm not a Levi altogether, right? I mean, it's not just by father. Yeah. Go ahead.
I really like it in this story that the word wine and whining
Yes.
are used.
It's exactly like synagogue boards of directors, right? Right? No, I'm just kidding. I'm really just kidding. I really am just kidding. Okay. Right. Yes.
How do the Kohen or Kohanim?
Kohanim, yes. How do they, I'm sorry?
How do they fit into this?
Well, because Aaron is the way that it worked. See, the way that it was originally in the Torah was that all of the tribe of Levi were priests. But then at the beginning of Numbers, of the book of Numbers, I think it's chapter 3, there are too many of them. And so it's an economic decision that actually happens. So what God then says, I'm pretty sure it's Numbers chapter 3, is that from here on in, only the descendants of Aaron will be the priests that function in that capacity, and the rest of the tribe of Levi will be their assistants. And that had, aside, that had economic implications. Because if you were a priest, you not only performed the animal sacrifices, but you got to eat of them, right? Whereas the Levites had to be supported through a special tax, right? So it was...
They didn't have property either.
Yeah, they didn't have property either. That's a whole other thing. In any case, we have to stop here, but let me just leave you with the thought that Moses, as the originator of the people Israel as a people Israel, right? I mean, Abraham was only one clan, right? But you have the 12 tribes when you get to Moses leading the 12 tribes out of Israel, is a really, if you compare him as the sort of the founder of the people as a people, and you compare him to Romulus and Remus in the Roman story, or you compare him to the emperor of Japan, or something like that, the Torah itself says, he's a very modest leader, a rather reticent leader, and one who doesn't really know how to put his foot down very well. How to put his foot down very well. He always has to go back to the source. And yet, so that when the rabbis later, as I said to you at the very beginning, when the rabbis later call him Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher, as opposed to Moses our king or our sovereign or something like that, I think they really were onto something, namely that his lasting influence in the Jewish tradition was as a teacher of the tradition and of the laws rather than as a leader. Okay? Be well. Sure.